And then, without so much as finishing his third glass, far less waiting for the other two, he bade us good-bye and went forth under the lamp of the hotel into the black night. We three turned to our places in the parlour, with the big red fire and 4 clear candles, and as we recapitulated what had passed, the first chill of our surprise soon changed into glow of curiosity. We sat late. It was the latest session I have known in the Old George. Each man before we parted had his theory that he was bound to prove, and none of us had any nearer business in this world than to track out the past of our condemned companion, and surprise the secret that he shared with the great London doctor. It was no great boast, but I believe I had a better hand at worming out the story than either of my fellows at the George, and perhaps there is now no other man alive who could narrate to you the following foul and unnatural events. In his young days, Fettes studied medicine in the schools of Edinburgh. He had a talent of a kind, the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears and readily retails it for his own. He worked little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. Nay, strange as it seemed to me when I first heard it, he was in those days well favoured and pleased by his exterior. There was at that period a certain extramural teacher of anatomy, whom I shall designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke had called loudly for the blood of his employer. But Mr. K. was then at the top of his vogue, and he enjoyed a popularity due partly to his own talent and address, partly to the incapacity of his rival, the university professor. The students at least swore by his name, and Fettes believed himself, and was believed by others, to have laid the foundations of success when he acquired the favour of this meteorically famous man. Mr. K. was a bon vivant as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked a sly allusion no less than a careful preparation. In both capacities Fettes enjoyed and deserved his notice, and by the second year of his attendance he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator or sub-assistant in his class. In this capacity charge of the theatre and lecture-room devolved in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises and the conduct of the other students, and it was a part of his duty to supply, receive, and divide the various subjects. It was with a view to this last, at that time very delicate affair, that he was lodged by Mr. K. in the same wind, and at last in the same building with the dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his hands still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed in the black hours before winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers who supplied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone when they were gone with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber, to repair the abuse of the night, and refresh himself for the labours of the day. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impressions of the life thus passed among the ensigns of mortality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest to the fate and fortunes of another, the slaves of his own desires and low ambitions. Cold, light, and selfish in the last resort, he had that modicum of prudence, miscalculated morality, which keeps a man from inconvenient drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted, besides, a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils, and he had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain some distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered unimpeachable eye service to his employer, Mr. K. For his day of work he indemnified himself by nights, by roaring, blackguardly enjoyment, and when that balance had been struck, the organ that he called his conscience declared itself content. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him as well as to his master. In that large and busy class, the raw materials of the anatomist kept perpetually running out, and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all who were concerned. It was the policy of Mr. K. to ask no questions in his dealings with the trade. "They bring a body, and we pay the price," he used to say, dwelling on the alliteration quid pro quo. And again, and somewhat profanely, "Ask no questions," he would tell his students, "for conscience' sake." There was no understanding that the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had the idea been broached to him in words, he would have recoiled in horror. But the lightness of speech upon so grave a matter was in itself an offence against good manners, and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. Fettes, for instance, had often remarked to himself upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hang-dog, abominable looks of the ruffians who came to him before the dawn, and putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning too immoral and too categorical to the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, to have three branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye from any evidence of crime. One November morning this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He had been awake all night with a racking toothache, pacing his room like a caged beast or throwing himself in fury upon his bed, and had fallen at last into that profound uneasy slumber that so often follows on a night of pain, and he was awakened by the third or fourth angry repetition of the concerted signal. There was a thin, bright moonshine. It was bitter cold, windy and frosty. The town had not yet awakened, but an indefinable stir already precluded the noise and business of the day. The ghouls had come out later than usual, and they seemed more than usually eager to be gone. Fettes, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as they stripped the sack from the sad merchandise, he leaned dozing with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer, with the candle raised. "God Almighty!" he cried. "That is Jane Gilbreth!" The men said nothing, but they shuffled near the door. "I know what I tell you," he continued. "She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible that she could be dead. It's impossible you should have got this body fairly." "Sure, sir, you're mistaken entirely," said one of the men. But the other looked Fettes darkly in the eyes, and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconceive the threat or exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuses, counted out the sum, and saw his hateful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts. By a dozen unquestionable marks, he identified the girl he had jested with the day before. He saw with horror marks upon the body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge in his room. There he reflected in length over the discovery that he had made, considered soberly the bearing of Mr. K's instructions, and the danger to himself of interference in so serious a business, and at last, in some perplexity, determined to wait for the advice of his immediate superior, the class assistant. This was the young doctor, Wolfe Macfarlane, a high favourite among all the reckless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had travelled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage, skilful on the ice or the links, with skate or golf club. He dressed with nice audacity, and to put a finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and a strong trotting horse. With Fettes he was on terms of intimacy. Indeed, their relative positions called for some community of life, and when subjects were scarce, the pair would drive far into the country in Macfarlane's gig, visit and desecrate some lonely graveyard, and return before dawn with the booty to the door of the dissecting room. On that particular morning, Macfarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fettes heard him and met him on the stairs, told him his story, and showed him the cause for his alarm. Macfarlane examined the marks on her body. "Yes," he said with a nod, "it looks fishy." "Well, what should I do?" asked Fettes. "Do?" repeated the other. "Do you want to do anything? Less said, soonest mended, I should say." "Someone else might recognize her," objected Fettes. "She's as well known as the Castle Rock."